you've written some very interesting books, which I have enjoyed very much. I just want you to share and tell about your books. Would you do that?
Yes, I'd be glad to. Actually, I wrote one book on the Norsemen in America before cryptography was discovered. This was in 1962. These are the three that were written after Alf Manji discovered runic cryptography. The first one is Norse Medieval Cryptography in Runic Carvings. That was put out in 1969. The second, I'm sorry, 1967. The second one is titled Ancient Norse Messages on American Stones. It was put out in 1969. And the last one is Runic Records of the Norsemen in America, which was published in 1974. I have to tell you that these books were written while Manji was feverishly hunting up and solving new cryptograms, of which he solved 67 during about a 10-year period. Of about half of these, as I think I mentioned earlier, about half of these came from Norway directly. The other half were scattered all the way from Norway to Greenland to New England to the Mississippi River Basin. This was only a part of my activities. Actually, I gave about 35 lectures on this subject, a lot of them at American universities. The two most that I like to remember the most were given at Cambridge University in England and at the University of Oslo. The one at Oslo was particularly interesting because King Olav VI himself showed up as a guest, which of course was very much appreciated.
Ole, my feeling is that you're all alone in saying that these runic inscriptions have indeed cryptograms and so on. How do you feel about, or aren't you alone? And if you are, how do you feel about being alone in that position?
Well, indeed I am not alone. The trouble is that I am alone insofar as those in Norway, runologists and linguists, who have studied cryptography and have rejected it. The trouble is not with the cryptography. What they do not realize is that cryptography is not a matter of the Norse language. Cryptography is 3,000 years old. That's about a couple of thousand years longer, I believe, than the Norse language, as in the ancient, the Old Norse has been, about 1,000 years older than the Norse has been used.
My next question is the why. First of all, why would Norsemen leave runic stones scattered across our landscape, and then why would they put hidden messages or cryptograms in them? I'd like you to deal with that.
Well, of course, in the first place, they are themselves a solid proof that Norsemen reached those places. And furthermore, they must have stayed there for quite a while, because you cannot concoct a runic cryptogram in an hour, and you cannot carve it on a stone where there are maybe 200 symbols, and the longest ones, in just a few days. It takes a long time. The fact, of course, is that lots of Norse priests were engaged in, thought it was fun apparently, of making runic cryptograms. Half of them, remember, are in Norway, mostly carved on the interior of Norway's state churches, the oldest churches in Norway. And the rest of them, very fortunately were produced and left by people who migrated westward to Iceland, to Greenland, to Vinland and New England, and on westward as far as the Mississippi River. That is a fortunate thing because that leaves unassailable evidence that Norsemen actually were at those places. Furthermore, any place which has such a cryptogram, there was necessarily a Norse priest present. Only they knew how to make these cryptograms. As to why they did them, made them in the wilderness, that is an interesting question. Of course, they had probably made some before they left Norway or on the way, but they certainly wanted to leave a message which no one could read except a certain selected few.
Get your idea of the future. Ole, you're not going to be here indefinitely. What would your dream be? Who should continue this work, or how can it go on after you're out of the scene?
Well, as for future, don't forget that the wall paintings in the caves of southwestern France took about 2 generations before they were accepted as not being fakes but authentic. Stonehenge in western England had an even tougher battle in which the scholars who were supposed to know denied vehemently that this was not an ancient kind of a structure. And finally, everybody now has agreed that it is. So it is no new thing for something new, as this is, to be rejected, especially when those scholars who are supposed to be the authorities perhaps feel offended at not having discovered it themselves, having, so to speak, stumbled over it for years and years and not been able to discover what it was all about.
You mean immigrant Yankee Norsemen are questionable because we rock-ribbed genuine Norwegians cannot be told what really the truth is?
Well, I think we Americans can take the truth pretty well, but there are some scholars, the top runologists and linguists in Norway, have had a very tough time of it and have not been willing to admit, to this day, have not been willing to admit. They simply reclined back into silence about 12 years ago now. And I kept knocking on the door, but they wouldn't have anything more to say. That's the way it stands. For this reason, I started a couple of months ago writing a final article in which I say, now at age 85, this is the last thing that I shall have to say on this subject. It has to be left to younger minds and bodies. And this article will be published sometime this spring when it is finished, and will be sent to everyone that would be vitally interested in it, both opponents and those who are in favor. And don't for a minute think that, that the ones that are in favor do not outnumber the opponents, because the opponents are a rather embattled little group.
Ole, I'd like you to give us your credentials, your credibility. What is your background for making these wonderful statements?
Well, I really have an advantage over my opponents, an important advantage in this sense. that I have a PhD in physics and mathematics from the University of Chicago. And it so happens, as I tried to explain, that runic cryptograms are mathematical, both in nature and in procedures.